There's a big difference between cheap electric bikes and expensive electric bikes, and this is very important in any other sector. It's more important even in electric bikes, and I say that because there's a lot more that can go wrong that will be more expensive to fix on an electric bike versus other bikes. So the biggest difference between a cheap electric bike and an expensive electric bike is going to be the battery and the motor, and most specifically the battery and the motor, the manufacturer, so the size and the power, so size of the battery and power of the motor, and in addition, the brand and the manufacturer of the batteries. So number one, I'll start with the size and the power, size of the battery and power of the motor. So a cheap electric bike, generally speaking, would be a smaller battery and a smaller motor. Now, that's not necessarily true because you will see some smaller motors and smaller batteries that might be more expensive, and you would ask the question, why? Well, that comes back to brand and manufacturer. Just like anything else, a watch, pair of shoes, why are Nikes more expensive than, a Fila or a Reebok? And the reason is brand and manufacturer. So there's certain quality elements that go into these products based on the management of the production and the quality control and things of that nature. So certain brands have invested more money in quality controlling their motors and their batteries to ensure that they're going to last and not break down. So that's a big distinguisher between a cheap bike and an expensive electric bike. Cheaper electric bikes are not going to be as focused on the quality of the battery and the motor. So it's something to pay attention to, especially if you're going to be riding your electric bike a lot. You really don't want to buy a cheap electric bike. The battery may not last for many charges. The motor may give out after not too many miles. An expensive electric bike, in theory, should be better quality controlled to last a little bit longer, or a lot longer for that matter. So the big thing really is on the battery side, cheap electric bikes are going to have cheap lithium-ion batteries. And that's going to mean that battery is just not going to last for very long. And going back to the brands, it's no different. So Samsung actually makes cells for some electric bike batteries. Those are some of the best, batteries on the market, batteries with Samsung cells. However, there are some other companies. We use a different company that actually is very similar to Samsung in terms of the componentry, but a little less expensive. Because quite honestly, not everybody can pay for the nicest brand names, but you still want the same quality. So at 630, we've had to distinguish between, what's a necessary upgrade and not a necessary upgrade to ensure good quality of all of our electric bikes. But that's really what's going to distinguish is the manufacturing of the batteries and the motors. What kind of team do they have on the assembly line? How careful are they paying attention to it? What kind of cells do they use inside the battery? Are they proven, not proven? And then what kind of factory made the entire bike? Did they quality control it? Did they check for errors before they left? A really good factory, difference between a cheap electric bike and an expensive one is also the quality control at the factory. So an expensive electric bike is going to run through a whole gamut of tests. They're going to turn it on and off at the factory. They're going to check it. They're going to make sure it works. A cheap electric bike might just leave straight from the factory and come to the US without many quality control checks. And it's going to go straight to the consumer without really having passed through many tests. And so that may leave you, the consumer, sitting with a product that doesn't work. Now, if you've bought it from a company with a good return policy or bought it from Amazon or something, you should be able to return it and get your money back. But you want to make sure, you're not just getting a bike that you're going to have to send back. You want to be able to use it. So, my recommendation is I would say, try not to buy the cheapest product of anything if you can. If you really don't think you're going to use it much, then you can go that direction. But in the electric bike arena, cheap electric bikes definitely won't perform as well as more expensive electric bikes. How much more and how much more money you need to spend is really up to you depending on what you're looking for. Some great alternatives to some cheap electric bikes while still being money conscious. Number one, I would say 630. That's sort of our brand identity, as being a great value product. So we're not trying to be the cheapest electric bike. We're not trying to be the most expensive electric bike. We're trying to be a great value while providing a quality product. In addition to that, I would say there are some other direct-to-consumer electric bikes that you can get a really good deal on. I can't name any off the top of my head that I would recommend necessarily, but if you can find an electric bike company that says we go direct-to-consumer, that's a great way to cut down cost a little bit. When you look at the electric bike landscape, they're really expensive in terms of how high they can go. I've seen them as low as $500. I've seen them as high as $13,000. So there are some good alternatives in there that will provide good value. Just make sure whichever electric bike you decide to purchase, you're not just buying it because it's a cheap electric bike, you're buying it because it's perfect for your use. I personally haven't owned any cheap electric bikes. I'll be honest and say we've done some competitive research, and we've bought different electric bikes to test them, see if we like them. I've also been to numerous factories and ridden, all sorts of electric bikes, from the most expensive to the least expensive. And what I can say is, on first ride, you can't always necessarily tell the difference between a cheap electric bike and an expensive electric bike. If motors are the same across both, they both may perform the same, and a $1,000 bike may perform the same as $2,000 or $3,000 for that matter. What I can say is over time, you're gonna see the lifetime value of the expensive product be more, meaning I've seen them last a lot longer. So you wanna make sure, if you're gonna ride the bike a lot, spending a little more money up front doesn't mean you're really paying more over the lifetime of ownership, because you might not need to replace that bike. And on the cheaper bikes too, what I've seen, actually myself from a factory, they sent me an electric bike sample, and what happened was after 2 charges, the battery would not charge anymore. So that's a big issue, is if you're looking at a cheap electric bike, the battery issues could be potential for more. It's happened to me. And I realized at that point, that's one big reason why we can't put the cheapest batteries in our electric bikes. So again, it's things to consider depending on what you're buying the bike for, and can you buy components and parts that can be replaced on these cheap bikes. Be careful too with cheap electric bike manufacturers. Do they keep replacement parts in the US? Do they have experienced technicians in the US that you can be referred to? So in case an issue or problem arises, you can turn to them. So yeah, that's my suggestions.